I didn't scream. I didn't slam the door. I just stood there in my cap and gown, holding my diploma, while my father looked past me at his phone and said, "Your brother got into the University of Toronto engineering program. Full scholarship." He said it the way you'd announce the weather. Like I hadn't just walked across that stage. Like the 4 years of working double shifts at a Tim Hortons and a grocery store simultaneously, finishing my accounting degree with a 3.8 gigapascals, hadn't happened at all. My mother patted my arm once. "That's nice, sweetheart." Then she turned to call my brother to congratulate him. I drove home alone that night. I stopped at a gas station on the highway outside Edmonton, bought a coffee I didn't drink, and sat in my car for 40 minutes doing the math in my head. Not because I'm dramatic, because math is how I process things. I calculated exactly how many hours I had worked to pay for that degree. I calculated the interest I'd paid on my student line of credit. I calculated how many family dinners I had attended, where my brother's acceptance letters were displayed on the fridge, like trophies, while my dean's list letters were left in a pile on the counter. The number was embarrassingly high, and I decided, sitting in that parking lot with a cold coffee and my diploma on the passenger seat, that I was done adding to it. I want to be clear about something before I go further. My brother, Daniel, is not a bad person. I want you to understand that because it matters to what happened later. He was always kind to me growing up. Awkward, a little oblivious the way youngest children sometimes are when they've been shielded from everything, but genuinely kind. The problem was never Daniel. The problem was what my parents made him into, and what they made me into by comparison. Growing up in our house in Street Albert, just outside Edmonton, there was an unspoken rule that I understood by the time I was 9 years old. Daniel was the investment. I was the backup plan. He was the one they talked about at family dinners, the one whose hockey tournaments they rearranged their schedules for, the one my father would drive 4 hours to watch play in a regional competition, while I took the bus to a city math competition alone. I came second in that competition. Nobody asked about it. I don't tell you this to make you feel sorry for me. I tell you because you need to understand what I built myself into because of it. When no one is watching, you learn to watch yourself. When no one is keeping track of your accomplishments, you learn to keep extremely precise track of them yourself. By the time I graduated, I had a spreadsheet, and I mean a real, color-coded, properly formatted spreadsheet, documenting every dollar I had earned, every dollar I had spent, and every dollar I had contributed to the household since I was 16 years old. Not because I was planning anything, just because recording things was the only way I could prove to myself, on the nights when I felt invisible, that I actually existed. After graduation, I did what I had quietly been planning for 2 years. I accepted a job offer in Vancouver with a mid-sized accounting firm, signed a lease on a 1-bedroom apartment in East Van, packed my car, and left. I told my parents I was moving. My mother said, "That's very far." My father asked if Daniel could have my bedroom for a study space. I said yes, finished loading my car, and drove west for 13 hours, without stopping except for gas and a sandwich in Kamloops. I want to be honest. The first year in Vancouver was hard in a way I hadn't fully prepared for. I knew almost nobody. My apartment was small, and the building was noisy, and the cost of living was genuinely shocking after Alberta. I was making $58,000 a year before tax, which sounds reasonable until you are paying $1,850 a month in rent and trying to pay down a $22,000 student line of credit at the same time. I ate a lot of rice and frozen vegetables. I worked late most nights because I wanted to prove myself at the firm, and also because the office was warm and had decent coffee. But I was building something. I could feel it the way you feel a foundation being poured even when you can't see it yet. I got promoted after 14 months. I started making $71,000. I opened a TFSA and started putting $400 a month into it. I paid off $8,000 of my student debt in 18 months. I made 1 friend, then 2, then a small circle of people who knew me only as the person I had chosen to become, with no history attached. My parents and I talked occasionally, maybe once a month, then once every 6 weeks. The calls were polite and short. My mother would tell me about Daniel's progress at university. My father would ask if I had met anyone. I would answer both questions with minimal information, and we would hang up. It was not hostile, it was just empty. I had stopped needing things from them, which meant there was less to talk about. This went on for almost 4 years. Then my father called on a Tuesday evening in February. I remember it was February because I had just filed my taxes and was feeling the particular satisfaction of someone who enjoys doing their taxes. He didn't ask how I was doing. He said, "Your mother and I are in a difficult situation and we need your help." I asked what kind of situation. He told me. He and my mother had taken out a home equity line of credit against the house in Street Albert 2 years earlier to help Daniel with his tuition and living expenses in Toronto, because his scholarship had only covered part of it. The line of credit was $45,000. They had also, separately, made some investments through a financial advisor that had not performed the way they expected. They were now behind on their mortgage payments. They needed $12,000 to cover the arrears and some other expenses. I was quiet for a moment, then I said, "How does this involve me?" My father said, "Your family." I told him I would think about it and I would call him back. I did not call him back. I thought about it for 3 days, and the more I thought about it, the less I was able to locate any logic by which this was my problem. I had never received a cent of help from my parents for school or housing or anything else. I had, in fact, paid rent from the age of 17 and contributed regularly to groceries. The house they were now struggling to keep was not a house that had ever made room for me in any meaningful way, and $12,000 was, at that point, almost everything I had managed to save after 2 years of careful, deliberate effort. I called my mother instead of my father because I wanted a different angle on the story. She was calmer about it than he had been, but the details were the same. She mentioned twice that Daniel was under a lot of pressure at school, and she didn't want him to know about the financial situation. She mentioned that they had always done their best. I listened, and I said I understood, and I told her I needed more time. What I actually did was call my bank, pull up my records, and spend an evening confirming exactly what I already knew, that I could not give them $12,000 without setting myself back significantly, and that there was no guarantee this would be the only request. I know how these things tend to go. I had watched it happen to other people. You give once, and the need doesn't resolve. It just recalibrates to include you as part of the solution. I sent my father a message a few days later. I told him I was not able to help financially at this time. I said I was sorry they were in a difficult position, and I hoped they could find a path forward. I kept it short because I had learned a long time ago that the more I explained myself to them, the more material they had to argue with. My father did not respond. My mother sent a message 2 days later that said, "I hope you know that actions have consequences, Rachel." I saved the message. I save everything. Then silence. 6 weeks of it. I assumed we had arrived at the new normal, which was fine with me. I was busy. I had just been offered a senior associate position at the firm. I was looking at one-bedroom condos to buy because the rental market was becoming genuinely untenable, and I had enough saved for a down payment on something small if I was careful. It was a Thursday morning in April when I got the text from a number I didn't recognize. It said, "Hey, this is Daniel. I'm in Vancouver for a conference. I know this is out of nowhere. Can we grab a coffee? I'd really like to talk to you." I stared at that message for a long time. My first reaction was suspicion, and I'm not ashamed to say so. Daniel and I had not spoken in nearly 8 months. He had not reached out when I moved to Vancouver. He had not reached out when our parents had their financial crisis. He had not, as far as I knew, ever really thought deeply about the dynamic in our family, because he hadn't needed to. Things are much easier to ignore when they're working in your favor. My second reaction, about 20 minutes later, was something more complicated, because Daniel was not the one who had hurt me. He had been a participant in a system he hadn't designed, and he had always been kind. And he was my brother, and I had not spoken to him in 8 months, and apparently he was in my city and asking to see me. I replied, "Okay, Saturday at 10. There's a cafe on Commercial Drive. I'll send you the address. I want to be honest about my state of mind going into that meeting. I was not warm. I had prepared myself for the possibility that this was a mission. That my parents had sent him as a softer approach after my father's silence hadn't worked. I had decided I would listen without committing to anything, and that if he brought up money, I would end the conversation. He was already there when I arrived, sitting at a corner table with a coffee, looking tired in a way that surprised me. Daniel has always had the particular ease of someone who has never had to fight for much. He didn't look easy that morning. He looked like he hadn't slept. We said hello. He asked about my job. I answered briefly. He asked about Vancouver. I said it was fine. There was a pause that stretched long enough to become uncomfortable, and then he said, "I owe you an apology." I didn't say anything. I waited. He said he had been doing a lot of thinking since he found out about our parents' financial situation. He said he'd started asking questions, and the answers had led him somewhere he hadn't expected. He said he'd found out the home equity line of credit wasn't only taken out for his tuition. Part of it had been used to cover other expenses, their own debts, money that had nothing to do with his education. He said he'd confronted our parents about it, and the conversation had not gone well. I kept my face still. I asked him what kind of other debts. He hesitated, then said it. Our father had a gambling problem. Not catastrophic, not the kind you see in movies, but steady and persistent sports betting, mostly through apps on his phone. Daniel had found the transaction records because our mother had finally shown them to him when she needed someone to help her understand the full picture. My father had been hiding it for years. The line of credit, the investment losses my father had described to me, they weren't bad luck. They were the result of choices he had made consistently, over a long period of time, and then framed as external misfortune when the bill came due. I asked Daniel if he was telling me this, because our parents had sent him to explain. He said no. He said he was telling me because it was the truth, and he thought I deserved to know it, and also because he needed to say out loud to someone that he was not okay with what had happened. That when he understood the full picture, including how I had been treated, and what had been asked of me, he had felt something shift in him that he didn't know how to describe. We sat there for a while without talking. I want to tell you exactly what I felt in that moment, because it's important, and it took me a long time to understand it. I did not feel victorious. I did not feel vindicated in the way I had sometimes imagined I might if the truth ever came out. I felt tired. And then, underneath the tiredness, something that took me another few minutes to identify: relief. Not because I had been right about my parents. I had always known that, but because my brother was sitting across from me, looking me in the eye, and telling me that he saw it, that he finally, actually saw it. Daniel had brought documentation. I realize that sounds strange, but he is an engineer, and apparently we are both people who document things. He had screenshots of the transaction records our mother had shown him. He had a note their financial advisor had sent outlining the losses. He had, on his own, done the math on what the home equity line of credit had actually paid for versus what they had told him it was for. I showed him my spreadsheet, the one I had maintained for years. He looked at it for a long time without speaking. Then he said, "You've been keeping track of all of this since you were 16? I said yes. He said, "I didn't know any of this was happening." I told him I believed him. We stayed at that cafe for over 2 hours. We talked about things we had never talked about, because there had never been space for it in our family, the way the favoritism had worked, how it had felt from my side, what he had understood and not understood. He told me he had been carrying guilt he couldn't name since he left for university, a sense that something in our family wasn't right, but that he hadn't wanted to look at it directly. I told him I understood that too. I'm not sure I would have been braver in his position. Before we left, he asked me what I wanted to do about our parents. I told him what I had decided. I was not going to give them money. I was not going to call them and have a cathartic confrontation. I was not going to write a letter, or demand an apology, or try to engineer a moment of accountability. Not because they didn't deserve to be held accountable, but because I had learned something important about myself over the previous 4 years. My energy is finite. The time I have to build my life is finite. And I had already spent enough of both looking back. What I was going to do was document everything, clearly and completely, in the same way I document everything. And I was going to speak to a lawyer not to sue anyone, but to understand my rights and my options, because information is how I protect myself, and I wasn't going to stop doing that now. Daniel nodded. He said he wasn't going to continue subsidizing the situation either. He had been sending our parents $800 a month from his salary since he started working, something I hadn't known. He said he was going to stop. He said he was also going to stop pretending that the family dynamic had been normal or fair, and that he was sorry it had taken him this long. I didn't cry until I got home. Not sad crying. The other kind, the kind that happens when something you have been carrying for a very long time, is finally, gently, set down. My parents called me twice, in the following 2 weeks. I did not answer. My mother sent a long message that covered, in order, guilt, appeals to family loyalty, a suggestion that I was being selfish, and a description of everything they had sacrificed for me when I was young. I read it carefully. I saved it the way I save everything. I did not respond. My father sent one short message that said, "This isn't over." I saved that one too. I bought the condo in June. It's a 1-bedroom in East Vancouver, on the 3rd floor, with a small balcony where I can see the mountains on clear days. I put $41,000 down on it. I know that number exactly, because I know every number exactly. I signed the papers on a Friday afternoon, and then I sat on the floor of the empty apartment before the furniture arrived, and ate takeout sushi, and looked at the mountains, and thought about the gas station parking lot outside Edmonton, 7 years earlier, with a cold coffee and a diploma and a calculation running in my head. The number I was calculating now was different. Daniel and I talk regularly now. Not every week, but often enough that it feels real. He is still figuring things out about our parents, about his own role in all of it, and I try to give him space to do that without either rushing him or holding it against him that it took him longer than it took me. We are building something new, the two of us, without the scaffolding of the old family structure holding it in a particular shape. It feels careful, and a little tentative, and also, honestly, like the most genuine relationship I have had with anyone in my family in my entire life. I think about my parents sometimes. Not with the intensity I used to. More the way you think about a difficult chapter of a book you've already finished, not with anger exactly, but with a kind of sober clarity about what it contained and what it cost. My father is still, as far as I know, making the same choices. My mother is still, as far as I know, managing the consequences of those choices, and calling it something else. That is their life, and they are welcome to it. What I know is this. No one gave me a financial cushion. No one cleared a path. No one held space for my accomplishments, or told me I was enough, or showed up when I walked across a stage. I built every single thing I have from the ground up, in spreadsheets and double shifts and nights in a small apartment eating rice, and refusing to give up on the math. And the math, eventually, worked out. I have a home. I have my brother back. I have a career I am proud of, and savings I understand, and a life that is entirely, completely mine. They said I would never measure up. I just made sure I was the one doing the measuring.